Hey leaders, in this episode of Building a Culture of Collaboration, I am joined by Will Parker, founder and CEO of Principal Matters, LLC. In this episode, we're going to explore Will's expertise as a leader and consultant, working and connecting with thousands of leaders annually. Hear his thoughts regarding building effective teams and establishing and sustaining high-impact cultures of collaboration. So let's get started.
Intentional and purposeful focus on building a culture of collaboration is the secret for leaders striving to make a difference. In building a culture of collaboration, Kurtis and Lorna Hewson will share simple tips, ideas, and strategies to take your organization's collaborative efforts to the next level.
Welcome to episode 19 of Building a Culture of Collaboration. As always, I'm Kurtis Hewson, co-founder and lead learner of Jigsaw Learning. My partner in life and work, Lorna, is not able to join to be part of this podcast as we normally do, but I am super excited to be able to be joined by Will Parker, founder and CEO of Principal Matters and host of the Principal Matters podcast. So welcome to the show, Will. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, well, host of Principal Matters podcast, of which you are a guest also on my podcast, Kurtis.
Yeah.
So I just want to invite people to check out that episode, which I'll have to look it up in the show notes as we're talking. But I'm so excited because, you and I recorded, gosh, a long time ago. You're actually scheduled on my podcast August the 28th. Your listeners will be hearing this, I believe, sometime in September. So go back to the archives of Principal Matters and look for Kurtis Hewson episode 411, and you'll get to hear that engaging conversation.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure to include that in the show notes when we do post this one up, Will, because it was such a pleasure to get to meet you finally after being a longtime listener of your podcast and admirer of the work that you do. But for those that are viewing or listening to this episode who may not know who you are, give us a little bit of your background. What's your journey been to get you here, Will?
Thanks for asking. I grew up in West Tennessee, a farm boy in the middle of nowhere. My grandparents were farmers. Dad was in and out of the military. When I was 15, he decided to re-enlist, and they stationed him in New York. So I went from farm kid to city kid and was just in culture shock. Then he got stationed in Virginia Beach in the Norfolk, Virginia area. And then I went to school in Oklahoma. So even though my parents' home is still there in West Tennessee, and I was just there last week actually visiting my brothers and nephews and nieces, I have lived in Oklahoma for the last 30 years. I was a high school English teacher for 11 years, a high school administrator for 13 years, the executive director of Oklahoma's Association of Secondary School Principals and Middle Level Education Association for 6 years, and then the founder and owner of Principal Matters, LLC. This work I've done full-time. I've done it part-time for almost 10 years, Kurtis, but full-time for this, for the 23-24 school year. So stepping into my second year of this work. And I just love working with schools, in schools. I was in Louisville, Kentucky a week ago doing some training with a bunch of principals from the Archdiocese of Louisville's Catholic schools. They serve 48 schools across the Jefferson County area. And I got to go see 5 principals at their school locations the day before I did their PD. And my wife teases me, even when we're on vacation, she'll find me sometimes pulling off the road to look at a school. Yeah. I love schools. I can't get enough of them. And everywhere I go, I want to just dive right in and see what makes this school different and unique. And I love schools. I love teachers. I love students. And I'm so glad to get to do this work.
It's fascinating when you mention that because both of us have experiences, working in auditoriums or meeting spaces or large groups and facilitating learning, which is great. But I'm the same as you. I get the real enjoyment and the blood just pumping again, being in the actual schools and getting to really see people in their element. I mean, you can be in a room and having them share and discuss, this is what it looks like for me in my own context, but then to come and see incredible work that's happening in each and every school that we get the opportunity to be in.
So here's some trivia. Here's some trivia for you. You'll appreciate this. Some of the schools I was visiting in the Louisville area, a lot of them were built right beside either their Catholic churches or a parish. Some of them built in the late 1800s or at least the early 1900s. And one of the principals finally told me, because I was like, how can you have so many schools in this geographic area? And many of them aren't very far away. And he said, well, rewind more than 100 years ago. And when a lot of the ethnic groups were coming into the US in the late 1800s, they would build a church to serve their language speaking groups. So you might have a German group build a church, an Irish group build a church, a Scottish group build a church. And they also started schools at the same time too. And in those days they were free, and the nuns would offer the education that were provided. They would put 40 plus kids in one classroom. And so and some of them had photos going all the way back to the founding of those schools. And so, Kurtis, I love history like that, because every place you live has a little bit different twist on their history. Oklahoma has a very young history, because we've only been a state since 1907. We're less than 100. I mean, we're barely 100 years old in our statehood, because this was Indian territory. So we have 40 plus tribes that were relocated to this state. So whenever I visit states where their infrastructure is so much older, I just get so intrigued by the possibilities. But there's so much history here too. I was the principal of Skytook High School, which is just north of Tulsa in Osage County. And we were one of 2 schools in the state of Oklahoma that offered Osage language as a foreign language. And so it was such a neat opportunity to be a part of a community that had its own rich heritage too, in a different way. So I know I'm taking us way off script.
This is great.
Yeah, but I love learning, and I think that's part of what keeps me going as an educator is staying curious myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is fascinating when you get to examine some of the history and, understanding where schools are now based on some of the rich history that, you don't really get from the placard sign out front or from the mission statement that's been established there now. So, Will, I'm really fascinated. Before we get into the crux of the conversation, which is focused on building a culture of collaboration, I'd love for you to be able to share with our listeners and viewers how this Principal Matters work began, because when I first heard the story of how it started, I was fascinated, the beginnings of it to where it's at now. Can you share with us how Principal Matters came to be?
Well, thanks for asking. And I know your audience may be folks that serve in all kinds of capacities as educators, but Principal Matters for me was a passion project while I was still an assistant principal. In 2012, I was recognized as Oklahoma State Assistant Principal of the Year. And previous to becoming an administrator, I had been a language arts teacher, a creative writing teacher, an AP Lang teacher, and I love writing. I used to write with my students. And I kind of ran into this conundrum where I love the work. Our school is being recognized for its good work, but there was a part of my skill set I wasn't exercising anymore, and that was writing. So I began a blog for school leaders where I would just each week committed to 500 to 800 words of just a lesson I've been learning through this leadership journey. And I started posting that on Wednesdays and sharing it out with friends. And eventually that grew into the opportunity to turn that content into my first book, which I actually called Principal Matters, which was about the teamwork and the collaboration necessary to lead in school settings. That same content kept building. And 2 years later, I did a book called Messaging Matters with Solution Tree Press about motivating students, inspiring teachers, and reaching communities. And then that work turned into an opportunity to write a third book, which is called Pause, Breathe, Flourish, which is about it's self-care for educators, how to stay inspired in the work so that you can inspire others. So it's interesting, Kurtis. The writing itself kept giving me an outlet for taking the practices and then sharing those things out in a form that I enjoyed, a craft that I enjoyed. But that also turned into a podcast because in 2016, I decided to take the same content that I was sharing in my blog each week and record that content. So at first it was just me. And then over time, I began to invite guests. So we just celebrated our 400th episode and we have close to 1.5 million downloads. And so that has opened up opportunities for me now to go in and take the same lessons I've been teaching through my writings and books and do work with principals primarily, but also assistant principals. Also, sometimes I do PD directly with their teachers on engagement or messaging or communication or self-care. I also work with a lot of district level leaders. I do executive coaching. I lead an academy called the Grow Your Leadership Academy. I also do a series of masterminds for leaders where we meet virtually twice a month for problem solving. And so there's a lot of ways I could answer that question. What does Principal
Yeah.
Matters look like? It's become much larger than me. I've had to bring on some friends or family to help me manage the work side of this. But yeah, it's been a joyful journey.
I imagine too of what started as a humble opportunity to just reflect on your own learning and share that without necessarily I'm going to reach a point of having 1.5 million downloads, but I'm just sharing this learning. But I imagine the conversations it's allowed you to have has just deepened your understanding and learning alongside. I find the same thing, especially in we did the same with our podcasts of starts out with us just using it as an outlet for sharing, but then realizing if we bring on guests, the learning becomes just deeper and
Yeah.
almost becomes like a PD for
Well, it
yourself.
does. I
Just in
remember when
sharing
I
that.
was finishing my master's degree, one of my professors pulled me aside and she appreciated my writing at the time and said, Will, PhD work requires a lot of writing and you like to write. So have you considered going ahead and moving into your doctoral program? And I had to pause for a moment and I just said to her, at the time I earned my master's, I was just stepping into school admin. I was still teaching and looking for my first admin position, but we had four small children. My wife had sacrificed so much for me to be able to go to class after classes, to
Yeah.
do that. And I just said, I can't imagine giving another couple of years to another degree in the sacrifices that my family would have to endure to do that. But the funny part is now that I'm working on my fourth book now, and now that I've done this work, you're right. The engagement and the time that I've spent with other leaders and in other schools, I may not have a degree beside my name that says, that I'm not Dr. Parker. Sometimes people call me that and I have to correct them. But I feel like the level of learning that I've been able to do through this work has just given me another degree in terms of understanding the systems, the practices, and the models happening way beyond my own because
Mhm.
of the time I've been able to spend with other leaders.
So I want to hone in then, Will, because you mentioned around that Principal Matters, that first book that you put out that then has grown to something much bigger than yourself, as you've
Mhm.
said. You talked about, you know, really addressing creating teams and how we effectively collaborate from a leadership
Mhm.
position. And I'd love for you to just expand on that a little bit for us. In this podcast, we really
Yeah.
focus on building that culture of collaboration. So share a few insights that you would share with leaders, and then we're going to unpack it even further as we go.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Curtis, because the full title of my first book, Principal Matters, is the courage, action, and teamwork necessary for school leaders. And I
Mhm.
chose those words carefully because, first of all, I believe anybody who's in education, it requires an enormous amount of courage to show up every single day into climates where some people want to be there and some don't. And so for me, the definition of strong leadership, whether it's in a classroom or in a school-wide setting, is someone who has the courage to do what others aren't willing to do. That's why we need leaders. Um, but we also have to take action, which means that we have to employ the practices necessary to actually accomplish the work. So we have to be skilled, we have to develop our craft, we have to understand our standards, we have to understand student engagement. But then the third part of that is teamwork. Because, and this is where I think that so many times we sell ourselves short of the ability to accomplish the goals that we've actually set for ourselves. And part of this is because as teachers, we're so used to the autonomy of, I've got to figure it out.
Mhm.
I develop my curriculum. I work on my lesson plans. I engage the kids. I manage classroom management. It's a badge of honor for me not to ask for help, because I need to do
Yeah.
this work. But what I began to realize, even in the classroom, but especially when I became a school leader, was I'll give you an example. One day I remember an older teacher talking to me about my classroom practices. And she said, "Will, do you realize how much your students actually want to help you, like with some of your classroom processes?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She was like, "I mean, think about some of the things that you're doing when you're starting class, which is handing back papers or giving kids resources or updating your makeup calendar. Um, have you ever thought about just assigning some of those tasks to some of your students who could also help manage those things too?" And I don't know why I had never thought of that. So
Yeah.
the light bulb went off and I was like, wow, what would happen if I began to like actually invite my students into the processes that I'm doing each period that these kids are coming out? I was a secondary guy. And suddenly I'm finding those pieces something I can train kids to help me with so that I can do the thing only I can do, which is instruction and engagement with those kids in the way that I could work as a teacher. Now, fast forward to my work as an administrator. Um, Part of our daily routine as we started our day was we would welcome everyone in, we would start school. And the way we set our schedules, and this is different for everybody, but I'm giving you Will's story, is second period would be when we would do our morning announcements, welcome everyone back. We just wanted to make sure everybody was in the building to hear the important things that we needed to happen. But I've begun to quickly realize that if that responsibility fell on me or the office staff every single day, there's always something going on that would be really distracting during that time when we're calling everybody's attention to the day. So at some point in my leadership, I started engaging students in the summer to say, hey, would you be interested in helping us run our morning announcements and get those things out? So that meant I met with them and I would train them and I'd give them a script. And then we created a system where people would send those announcements down and we would put them in a specific folder. And so there would be times when I was not available because someone was in a meeting with me or had pulled me out into a conversation, and the announcements would come on and there would be the voice of a student welcoming everybody to the day, inviting them to say their pledge, giving the announcements. That's just one small example, Kurtis, of a piece of your day that is enhanced because you invite other people into it. And what I like to encourage educators and leaders to do is take a step back from your work and ask yourself the question, what other parts of my day or my work could be enhanced if I invited the collaboration or the input of others, whether that's students or staff members or other teachers or other admins or my counselors, so I know that's going to look different depending on who's listening. And I never try to prescribe what that looks like for others, but it's just been an important part of my practice to recognize. It's my friend Danny Bauer who likes to quote this, and I don't know who he stole this from, but I'm going to give him credit, who always says that isolation is the enemy of excellence. Yeah. And so how do you pull yourself away from the isolation that we so often default to and instead look for opportunities to invite engagement?
It's interesting that you mentioned Danny. We had him on the podcast recently too, and loved engaging with his thoughts there. And I really like, I mean, in the show notes that we had prepped a little bit beforehand, you talked about this difference between flying solo, which sounds a little bit like your beginning classroom experiences, which are not different from mine at all, versus building a team and really seeing it as the difference between burnout and flourishing. So can you describe what you mean by that? Expand on that for us?
Well, let me tell you my burnout story, because when I stepped from classroom to school admin, one of my desires in school leadership was to be the kind of principal that I had always wanted to have. And I had had some good models in school leadership. I started teaching in a very large district outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Broken Arrow Public Schools. We had a couple of thousand kids on that campus. And when I transitioned into school leadership, I was leading in a school with about 1,400 students. And because of my time in the classroom for 11 years, I had had many examples of leadership, some of which had just been fantastic, but others that had really disappointed me. And I wanted to be a leader who followed up on teacher requests, was consistent, fair, and firm in my discipline, was able to respond, to respond in a way that people didn't feel like they were in the dark or didn't feel like that I was disconnected. What I thought that was going to look like was somebody who could wear a cape every day and show up and answer every need, every email, respond to every comment someone made to me in the hallway, and somehow at the end of the day, wrap up, tie a little bow on all of that and make sure that everything was good before I went home for the day. And what I discovered was an avalanche of input. And then I suddenly began to realize why my principals struggled to get back to me on things. Because when you walk down the hall as a school leader in a typical school, if you are engaging, people are going to stop and talk to you, but they're also going to relate to you their challenges. They're going to ask you for questions or help or resources. I carried a little notebook with me my first year, or every person that stopped me and talked to me, I would write it down so I could make sure to follow up with them if they had something they needed. What I discovered at the end of that first year was it would take me hours at the end of every day to respond to those things I had written in my notebook, or I would have to get up hours before school the next morning to finish all of those responses. And after my first year of trying that kind of routine of just constantly thinking I alone could try to find solutions to these things. And I'm not acting like there weren't other people on our team. There were. And for some reason in my mind, I just had to own every problem that came to me. And in addition, I was doing school activities and all the things that come with supervision and teacher evaluations and observations and basketball games and, choir contests. But I was, again, as I said earlier, the father of young children. So I would get home with barely enough time to see my wife and kids before they went to bed. And then I would stay up late and work and get up early and work. And I had stopped exercising. I had stopped caring about nutrition. I had stopped focusing on my spiritual growth. Everything had gone out the window except just school. And it was the second year of that when my wife's patience finally got to the point where she was like, okay, Will, we've got to talk. Yeah. And one night I opened my laptop to start working after the kids went to bed. And she just said, can we have a conversation? And I said, sure. So she sat down beside me and I shut the laptop and she said, well, the kids and I have decided that you are a husband and a dad on the weekends only. The rest of the time, the school owns you. And she didn't say it with resentment or bitterness, just like simple resignation. And then she said, in fact, you have become a shell of the man that you used to be. And when she went to bed that night, I've told this story in other settings, and sometimes people look at me like my wife's so mean. And I'm like, no, this was her holding up a mirror to me.
Yeah.
So when she went to bed that night, I opened my laptop and instead of working, I wrote a letter of resignation. And in that letter, I explained to my principal and my board that I had not figured out a way to do this work and care for myself and my family. And because of that, I would be leaving this profession and just finding something else to do. And I took that letter, Kurtis, to my office the next day and I put it in a folder and I set it on the corner of my desk and I made a promise. I said, I'm either going to begin to rediscover ways to reconnect with my own self-care, but also the ability to collaborate with others in this work, or this is the letter I'm giving, because I can go work at Home Depot and probably make as much money as I was making at the time to support my family. And so fast forward, I'm not saying I found a silver bullet, but just fast forward to, 7 years later when I was recognized as Oklahoma State, Assistant Principal of the Year.
We'll be right back to continue this episode.
Feeling overwhelmed with the expectations being placed on teachers, leaders, and educational systems to respond to the diverse needs of our learners?
Are you wanting to take your PLCs and RTI efforts to the next level?
It definitely takes a highly coordinated framework of structures and processes to maximize the collective capacity of your team to ensure success for all students. Collaborative Response is that framework.
Order your copy of our bestseller, Collaborative Response, 3 foundational components that transform how we respond to the needs of learners, which includes access to a comprehensive companion website. Join the thousands of schools using the framework to ensure high levels of success for students and staff. And now back to our conversation.
I had begun to introduce new practices, which included, first of all, taking care of me, getting up early, not to work, but to get some exercise in before school, taking time to connect with a friend at lunch and not just scarf down food, but actually finding another colleague to eat with and talk about school with, setting up an accountability system with others in my office who could come by and say, Will, your family needs you more than the school, go home now. But also I put away that notebook. Instead of carrying it down the halls, I began to recognize that leadership means, and this is true in the classroom too, the true work of an educator is to help someone else find solutions for their problems, not solve the problems for them.
Yeah.
And so when people began to engage me with needs, I would often say, well, listen, let's brainstorm some ways that we could possibly solve this. And sometimes they would walk away with their own solution. Or we might say, this is something that maybe we need to follow up on later. If this is still important to you at the end of the day, can you send me an email and I'll follow up with you? And I saw my emails drop by 50% because they didn't always want to follow up with me. Sometimes they just needed to vent. And so I was owning all these problems that sometimes people didn't even necessarily want to address. And then when people did follow up with me, then we could strategically look for solutions together. And so over time, I began to realize that the capacity of the work requires you building the capacity in other people. So that same lesson that I gave you about building the capacity in students to do announcements, I began to look at every part of my school in terms of who are the other people that are already on my team that I have access to, where I can leverage their talents and their input and their expertise so we can find solutions together.
Absolutely. It's fascinating when you mention the putting on a cape. My friend Darren Papard, who was on a episode as well, talked about it as Superman syndrome. And I was nodding the entire time he was talking because he and I and you all fell into that same place of we'll just be Superman to start, and everyone bring your problems and we will try and find the solution. And I did the exact same thing. As a leader, that's my job, is to help and solve problems. It wasn't done from it came from a good place, but wrong mechanism. So I want to explore this a little bit more around establishing teams, because it's one thing to say, bring everything to me and I'll solve it. That's not enabling your team. Then we move to that stage of, you described the delegation of tasks, which is a great starting place to be able to say, okay, here's what this person's going to do, here's what this person's going to do, such as you're engaging your students in the announcements. But then when we start to build teams, it's not about necessarily delegation of tasks, because those teams, we often say the room becomes smarter than any one individual.
Right.
And the teams are actually going to come up with next steps or solutions that far exceed what you, Will Parker, could have done as the administrator. The team becomes smarter, in a sense, smarter than the leader. And it becomes then the leader's responsibility of how do we create effective teams and mechanisms. So what have been some of your insights around the creation of those effective teams? So it's not always about the administrator, whether that's an assistant principal or principal, being the one to coordinate it, but leveraging expertise of others. Through that team structure.
So let me give you some nitty gritty. I'll give you an example of how that looked in my work. So I remember one year reading a book by Dave Ramsey, who everyone knows is kind of the financial guru around, debt reduction. His company that's located in Nashville, Tennessee, I'm not even sure how many employees he has now, probably 500. At the time that I read his book that he wrote called EntreLeadership, it was about 2012. So actually, it was the year I was transitioning from AP to principal. And I had worked for an amazingly strong principal who had learned how to build leadership teams within the school, really rely on leaders within those teams to carry the banner for the work that was happening within specific departments. But one of the things that I recognized, this just to give you another example, was my own lack of clarity on what some of the tasks were among our non-instructional staff. So for instance, if you think about your school in terms of your teachers, most of us who have been teachers feel pretty good about we feel pretty knowledgeable about what that process looks like in terms of managing lesson planning and student classroom management and instruction and being a part of a PLC. But then there's people within our schools whose work we think we know what they do, but we probably don't. Like your school secretary and your registrar and your school counselors, or maybe your media center specialists or your paraprofessionals. You may think you know what they do if you've done that work or if you supervise that work directly, but I had not. And so when I was reading Dave Ramsey's book, he had this practice with his employment onboarding that he called KRAs. He called them key results areas, which was developing a list of responsibilities for each of his employees that were their key results. These are the things you're responsible for building results in order for you to be an active part of this organization. Well, I stole that and I decided I want to call it KRAs for key responsibility areas because, and I went to my office staff and my counselors and I said, I'll be vulnerable. I'm stepping into this new role and there's a lot that you do that I don't understand. So could we first put together a shared Google Doc where you just list, what do you do on a daily basis? What do you do on a weekly basis? What do you do on a monthly basis? So that I can just see the tasks that you're managing regularly. So they did. And each one of them sent me their list. And then I took those lists and I actually alphabetized them, labeled them according to each staff person, and then set them all up in one document. And then I called a meeting and we shared them so they could all see their own and everyone else's. And we asked some questions. What are some things that you're doing that only you do? What are some things you're doing that are actually a duplication of someone else's responsibilities? What are some of the things that maybe you want to learn to do that you're not doing? And let's make sure that collaboratively we decide in this conversation who's the point person for the tasks that we know that someone has to be the person that I can say you're the final person responsible for this. And so sharing those key responsibility areas helped us to then modify those lists again so that we got them to a place where stepping into the school year, because we did this before the new school year began, everyone had a really strong sense of their key responsibility areas, their areas of performance, so that we were defining performance on the front end instead of spending the whole year correcting performance that was never defined. And so what I've discovered is that same model is really helpful when you're thinking about your approach to team building. And you and I in the learning setting, Kurtis, would call these establishing your norms.
Yeah.
But with non-instructional staff, they needed their norms too. And so what I didn't expect was how useful these lists became. In fact, we had 4 office secretaries in different locations, and each one of them took their KRAs. They didn't even ask to do this. I was just surprised one day when I showed up, and they had them printed out on these large sheets from our print shop. So when you walked into their office, on the front of their desk, you saw a list of the things that they were the point person for. And it was really cool. So let's say a kid's coming into the office and they're like, oh, the vending machine just took my money. Then one of the secretaries could go, oh, look right over there. You'll see that Miss So-and-so is responsible to help kids when they lost money from their vending machines. So they go over there and see her. What we also discovered was we could share out these lists with all of our teachers, and then boom, light goes off. Who do they go to when something's going on?
Yeah.
And who's actually managing the passwords for our student information system? Or who's actually the person that's processing those POs that you're submitting? Or who's actually the person that knows what the substitute process looks like at the end of the day? And so it began to just create clarity for the work that goes around supporting the work of instruction as well. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I wanted to give you that as an example of a nitty-gritty way of trying to build collaboration in a way that takes that load off of one person.
Well, we're going to continue along this thread, but there's a couple of key things that came out from that. Well, I think first is, and I hear this often when talking with leaders and have been able to reflect on it for myself as well, is the importance of vulnerability, of being able to say as a leader, and it's really hard to say, I don't know. I'm not sure of that answer. And for you to be able to say, I don't know how all of these different components of our organization work, but let's leverage the people who do. Well, that's a good first step of being able to throw off the Superman cape and invite others into that work. And then I think when you said, let's ask some reflective questions of what is it that you do, where's some overlap? Those aren't simple yes or no questions that you already have a predetermined answer. It takes the team to start focusing in on. So I was reminded, and I want to come to your thoughts around this, Will. Richard Dufour, I remember him years ago saying, and it was quite a provocative statement, and he had a place to go with it, of course, saying, in North America, we have settled in schools to work in groups, not teams. And he defined, or it said one of the defining characteristics is a team has clearly defined outcomes that they're getting to, and they've made it crystal clear. And it resonated for me when you were talking about creating and defining that clarity. In your mind, Will, what would be some other defining characteristics of the difference between a group and a team? Because I go into schools all the time and they say, oh yeah, we're really collaborative here. But I think what they're trying to say is we're really collegial. We get along and we support one another, but collaboration is different. So I'll turn that question to you. In your mind, what's the difference between a group and a team?
Well, I don't know if anything I'm going to say would ever be as profound as Rick DeFore, so I'll just give you Will's answer.
We stand on the shoulder of that giant.
My gosh, yeah. So I'll just give you the first answer that comes to mind when you ask how does that work look like in practice to build teams. And I'm going to say one of the first things I would encourage a leader to do is to model what you're asking in terms of behavior. So if the clearly defined outcomes are something that a team needs in order to be effective, sometimes those outcomes can't be clearly defined until you show people how to do it. Mm-hmm. So you can state your expectations, which I do think is important, but I also think it's important to actually model those expectations. So
go first as the leader, correct?
Yeah. So let me give you an example. In an office setting, the first place that most people go when they come to a school is the school office. And I have this philosophy that if someone walks into your school and they feel like a visitor, or in the worst case scenario, an intruder, then you've missed an opportunity to help them feel like a guest. So how do you create a kind of environment where the people who are walking into your school feel so welcome that they feel like a guest there, which is exactly how you want students to feel when they walk in your classroom. So in my, with our staff, especially, I'll come back to our office staff, we would practice how to welcome people when they're coming to our school to help them feel like guests. So that means as the leader, I'm having these conversations. Hey, I want to make sure that we've got coffee ready and we've got waters available. This is how people are going to sign in when they come in, but this is how we're going to welcome them when they come in. We're going to tell them that we're glad you're here and this is a great opportunity for us to serve you. What can we do? We're also going to make sure that we connect them with the people who can actually answer their questions. Mm-hmm. So let me also train you how I want to be treated. So maybe sometimes someone's coming in or even calling and they think that they need to talk to the principal because they have a concern, and he or she may be the person with the answer, but they may not be. So we would also do phone protocol. Let's rehearse a conversation. So parent calls, I've got a concern, third period, Mr. Smith said something to my student that I don't appreciate, or gave him feedback or her feedback on a lesson that I'm not unsure about. And my office staff would be prepared to say, thank you for calling. I know Mr. Parker would like to address this issue with you. Right now, he's involved in other responsibilities, but he would want me to ask you, have you spoken directly to the teacher yet to get feedback on the question that you have? Oh, you haven't? Well, I know that his planning period is coming up, 4th hour. I would like to leave him a note and have him call you. And if you're not satisfied with the conversation, then I know Mr. Parker would be glad to assist you in the follow-up, either calling you directly or setting up a meeting with that teacher. Could you please give me your number so that I can have this person connect with you? Now, you and I both know, depending on the age group, the personality of the parent, how difficult the situation is, how angry they are, not every conversation will go the same way. No. But unless you model and practice those behaviors, then instead what you get is people calling in a panic and people being sent to you that you may not actually be the person they need to speak to yet. Right. And so to answer your question, clearly defined outcomes first have to be taught.
We'll be right back to continue this episode.
This question is brought to you by WeCollab. Designed by educators for educators, this comprehensive digital system aligns with the foundational components of collaborative response. Moving from conversation to action, WeCollab empowers classrooms, schools, and systems to provide the very best response for each and every child by informing action-based decision-making with data and evidence supporting student success.
And now back to our conversation.
And they have to be modeled. And once you've taught them and modeled them, then those people that are learning them can begin to teach others. And so over the years that I was privileged to work in the school setting, as we hired new people, then the people that were trained could train the new people in those same kinds of behaviors and protocols and defined outcomes. So again, Kurtis, I know sometimes you ask a question and I give you an example without necessarily giving you maybe a theoretical response, but that's...
No, I love the examples
Yeah.
because it helps us just to really clarify and crystallize, what does that really look like when we put it in place? And this is the work that I engage with in leaders too, of, your prime responsibility as a leader is create systems, which is exactly what you're doing. And the systems are what endure. People are going to come and go, and myself as a leader at some point am going to transition out of this building and another person is going to come in. But if the systems are in place, then now we're tweaking systems, not feeling like we're rebuilding cultures over and over again. And those systems actually are what creates those cultures of collaboration for us over time.
No, I agree. Jen Schwanke, who also co-hosts my show, we've often talked about systems leadership versus people leadership. And so often you find leaders that tend to have a strength in one area, but maybe not in the other. And I would argue that you have to be able to really do both. You have to be able to develop the trust and relationships necessary to work with people in a place where they feel like there's belonging, while at the same time creating the systems necessary to help them achieve their tasks. Or as Jen would say, you can place all the right people on the bus, but if you don't have a map and a direction for the bus, then you're never going to go anywhere. And so you've got both. You've got to place the right people on the bus, but then you also have to navigate the processes and procedures and destinations for that bus to get to land in your destination. So I
love that analogy.
Yeah. So I may be over speaking, but I just want to try to give I've given you a specific example of modeling that, but I just want to encourage educators, especially education leaders, to think about that. Just take a step back from your school processes and ask, how do my school-wide processes reflect the same kind of engagement that I know works in a classroom? Because it's translatable. And I think for sometimes for school leaders, that may be the most helpful thing to just bring back to mind is, what do you know that works well in a strong classroom setting? And then ask yourself the question, how do I create that atmosphere in those same processes and procedures for a school-wide community? So as a school leader, my goal became ultimately anyone that walks into this school, onto this campus, needs to have the same kind of experience that I would have wanted them to have in my classroom. So how do I create this? And so there's no way one person could do that. So you have to build a team of other people where the caring and the character and the expectations and the norms are similar enough that that experience is something people have just stepping in. So probably the times my heart was warmed the most at the school was when a visitor or a guest, someone would come in. Maybe it's a parent, maybe it's someone delivering yearbooks, maybe it's the paper guy, and they would stop on their way out and maybe see me and say, "Hey, what a great school. And your kids are so polite, or your teachers are so helpful, or people make me feel so welcome." And I could pull the curtain back and show them all the craziness we had to deal with that day. And we had the same statistics that every other school had in terms of difficulties and challenges and economic distress and the number of kids on free and reduced lunches and all those things too. But what they felt and experienced when they walked in is a welcoming learning environment.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen by chance. That happens because you purposefully develop the kind of teamwork necessary to make that happen school-wide. And so It was an old, I won't say old is probably not the way to describe this friend of mine. It was a veteran superintendent friend when I was first an assistant principal, and I'll name her because she was a wonderful leader, Dr. Mary Jane Bias. I saw her leading a parent meeting one night with probably 200 parents in the room. And there had been some things going on in the district that were kind of contentious. So she'd called a meeting to answer questions and provide solutions. And it was so well run that when it was over, I just walked up to her and I was like, wow, that may have been the most productive parent meeting I've ever sat in. And she gave me this knowing look and she said, can I give you a little advice, Will, as a new leader? And I said, yeah. And she said, every setting is a classroom. I was an elementary teacher for 20 something years. And what you saw me do tonight was the same thing I did in my elementary classroom. I welcomed everybody in. I had set the expectations for what this meeting was going to be. I welcomed their input, but I created the norms for how we were going to speak to each other. And by the end of the evening, everyone felt listened to and they got the information that they wanted. She said, if you will approach every setting, whether it's a chamber meeting or a board meeting or a faculty meeting, or you're addressing every setting, if you address it like it's a classroom, you're going to find yourself with outcomes that are a lot more beneficial than if you don't.
I love that phrasing because I think about myself as a classroom teacher, and when I started to feel that I was having the greatest impact, it was when I had clearly established routines that the students had helped me create. So let's shift that to a school. I'm having the staff help create that. I had collaborative things happening where different skill sets were being accessed to lead different opportunities. There was then opportunities of, I don't have a strength in this area. How can I build upon it? How can we bring in student voice of, I know a direction we have to go based on my curriculum or my lesson outcomes, but I want the students to help me create that path to get there. And that's a great way to be able to look at that, because I have had a principle before of saying, you have to think about your teaching staff or your overall staff as your classroom of students. And that's not to demean or belittle the adults or to not assume competence, but the same thing of appreciating that structure, system, predictability, and clarity, I think, is what you're speaking to here, Will.
Yeah. No, I agree, my friend.
So we are reaching a point that we come to a question I always like to ask on this podcast, and I think I know where this is going to go because I think you've alluded to it already, but we like asking, in the spirit of, if you knew then what you know now, what advice would you give your past self in relation to establishing and sustaining highly impactful collaborative practices in an organization?
Yeah, I think I have spoken to it. If I knew then what I know now, I would have told my old self, tuck in your cape and quit acting like a superhero and ask for help. And because that is there, when I've used this analogy before with leaders, but I want you to imagine a coin, and every coin has two sides. And on one side of that coin is the word courage. And on the other side of that coin is the word humility. Because I believe that every educator, especially educators who are leaders, and I believe every teacher is a leader, and I said this at the very beginning of our conversation, it requires an enormous amount of courage to show up and do this work. You have a captive audience of kids who are by law required to be there, or their parents, and yet you're supposed to somehow turn them into a community of learners who trust you and can grow in their knowledge and understanding. That takes an enormous amount of courage. But on the flip side of that coin is humility, which is being able to recognize what you don't know and admit what you don't know and ask for help in those areas that you don't know until you learn. But even when you do learn, you still recognize what you don't know. And so there's two truths that I like to say to leaders, Kurtis, and this will, as we're wrapping up, I'll just leave you with this statement. But I like to remind leaders, especially when you're thinking about the legacy of your work, I say there's always two truths that are happening at the same time. And the first one is going to sound unkind. And that is, first, you're not as important as you think you are. Someday your school will exist without you. Your students will move on without you. if you have your picture on the wall of that school, someday if someone's going to walk by in 20 or 30 or 40 years and they won't know who that person was. So just remember, you're not as important as you think you are. The school would exist without you someday. On the flip side of that, and this is the kinder statement, you are way more important than you think you are. Every single day that you show up, you have the opportunity to be present, to be engaging, to remind someone of their value, to give someone hope that maybe didn't have hope before, to provide them with an opportunity for engagement and learning that they wouldn't have had if you weren't in the room with them, and maybe to leave a mark on their lives that could influence them for the better for the rest of their existence. And so I just, so if you haven't figured me out, there's always the complexity in the things that I say, Kurtis, which is those two things are true at the same time. So
Absolutely.
hold on to that courage, but then also practice the humility necessary to stay a learner.
I absolutely love that. Well, I'm out of a little bit of self-interest here. Love to hear what we can expect in your new publication that you had referenced at the start. Where do you think your sharing is leading to?
Yeah. So by the
Some
time
ideas that you're sharing in that,
I'm
or
I'm
intending to
working on a
share.
fourth book right now. So thank you so much for asking. I'm working on a fourth book right now that has a working title. So please don't steal this, listeners. Because at the time of our conversation, this hasn't gone to print. But I'm working on a book right now called Whose Permission Are You Waiting For? An Educator's Guide to Doing What You Love. And because in the work I'm doing now, Kurtis, a lot of the coaching I do with leaders, especially high-performing leaders and educators, is I'm watching them really wrestle with hard decisions and knowing how to make a good decision, knowing how to create multiple pathways for yourself when it comes to problem solving. And I'm finding myself explaining and modeling things more over and over again. And that's when I usually write a book. It's like when I keep saying that I have to say the same thing over and over again that I haven't written about in some other place, I'm going to write about it. So I've put together a book of 20 chapters that range from everywhere from the understanding the history of this work and education to understanding the different pathways that you can look at in doing the work, but making sure that whatever work you're doing is staying grounded in the thing you're most passionate about and making sure that the work that you're doing is work that you love. Because I believe that an educator, in order not to burn out, has to stay connected to their passion. And so that's the work I'm in the middle of right now.
Oh, super excited to see that. And I also love that idea of when it feels like I'm repeating similar things or I'm thinking about this through multiple different settings. Yeah, now's a good time to communicate that. So we'll make sure that we include in the show notes different ways to connect. But for those that are listening to the podcast, what would you suggest is the best way to connect with you if anyone wants to engage in a further
well, please
conversation
go to
or
my,
further learn?
you can find all my resources at my website, which is my name, williamdparker.com. If you are interested in any of my books or resources or my Grow Academies or my masterminds or executive coaching, you can always reach out to me at my email at will@williamdparker.com. If one of the most popular teacher professional developments I do is around my third book, Pause, Breathe, Flourish, the story of my burnout and how those lessons of self-care can be something to reignite the passion of your own teams. So there's a free study guide that comes along with that book. And I present on that book pretty regularly. By the time this podcast comes out, I probably will have just returned from a lot of beginning year PD where I'm doing that with teachers. Just to engage them in those reminders that that care for yourself means putting on that oxygen mask and breathing before you place that mask on other people.
I love that. That's a great reminder to end us off with. So, Will, thank you so much for taking the time to engage, to share some of the wisdom and expertise that you've gathered over time as a leader and working with leaders. And yeah, I really look forward to future connections with you as well.
Thank you, Kurtis. I appreciate your leadership and thanks for the opportunity.
All right, take care. Wow, so much to unpack from the conversation with Will, and there's just a few key learnings I'd like to hone back in on because some of the really specific examples that Will share are fantastic, but the underlying messages are really coming through. I love that idea of every setting is a classroom. I'm going to be taking that into my own reflective practice of how can we see what we know works effectively for engaging in learning and growth within a classroom and putting it into other settings. I can see again where that makes that incredible connection to the staff team on how do we set that up the same way we would set up an effective classroom, which really is about empowering, bringing voice and recognizing the skills in others, but that we're all growing and learning together. I also want to touch back on the two truths that Will shared. You're not as important as you think you are, which I've come to absolutely realize through this work and own personal endeavors. But then also on the flip side of that, you're more important than you think you are as well. And the difference that you can make, which is maybe quite long-standing when we think about the second, third, fourth order change that we engage in as leaders. I also loved that idea of duality in thinking, that the two sides of a coin, that we can practice humility while practicing courage at the same time, and how those are interrelated, that we can be vulnerable and admit that we don't know what we need to be able to do, while then also being able to empower others through that and modeling, and that courage that we need as a leader. But the courage really comes in the willingness to take action. And we didn't talk about this in the episode, but understanding that there's courage in taking action, knowing that what we take action towards might not work. It might not have the outcome that we think it will, but by employing that ready, fire, aim mentality, we're going to learn through that process. We're going to fire, we're going to take that action, we're going to aim, and then we're going to reflect and learn as we continue to go forward. So thank you so much to Will Parker for joining, for sharing his insights, and we'll ensure that there's some connections and further follow-up in the show notes to be able to reference. As always, we'd encourage you to like, subscribe to this episode, share it with a friend that you think would benefit from hearing Will's insights. And when he talks about the establishing an effective meeting, we'll also include in the show notes a guide that we have around 5 considerations to transform your team meetings that speaks to some of the things that Will alluded to as well. So as always, we wish you the best and look forward to engaging in future episodes.
Jigsaw Learning, founded by Kurtis and Lorna Hewson, is a team of educators who work with schools, districts, and educational leaders to establish collaborative response to ensure success for all students. Because every child deserves a team.